Random encounters, a staple of RPGs where you'll just walk around and then boom, time for a fight. But over the years, especially in recent years, as technology in consoles grew, people started to feel like random encounters started having less and less of a place when games were able to fully render the enemy on the field. But the way people treat RPGs when enemies are viewable for random encounters tends to be weird. Let me explain. The biggest complaint towards random encounters is the fact that they keep happening. The fact that you're just walking around and then boom, time for a fight because the game says so.
Sir. Okay, I'm getting real tired. You know what? Goodbye. I'm getting tired of you guys. Yo, get on my nerves. Like, let me leave. Like, I'm in the middle of trying. Oh my god. Like, oh my god. I'm trying to get out. Bro, let me go.
Which, if you can see the enemies, you can avoid them. Which is also the problem, at least from what I've seen, that when it comes to like, RPGs with enemies are visible on the world, people generally just use that as a way to avoid encounters entirely, because some people just don't want to play the game at all and just skip to the next story segment. So instead, they'll pretty much just run past enemies, and with the boss under-leveled, and be surprised that they're under-leveled and just complain again about the game being too difficult. Random encounters are there trying to get the player leveled up, because strangely, despite being able to run from encounters, once people in a random encounter, they generally just stay in the fight unless it's like very difficult fight, in which case they have to beeline the F out of there. It's one of those weird aspects where sure, seeing enemies means more control, but it also means the player just not going to play the game because, well, they have to fight an enemy. Why would they? Other thing is that RPGs of all kind will generally have some kind of item to reduce encounters. Whistling, for example, Megaton handles it, where you'll generally get something like Estoma, which stops random encounters only for only if the enemy is below you, which is the appointed threshold. The enemy is lower level than the player, which is a threshold that I've seen people, at least in games like Persona 1, 2, and 2 Eternal Punishment, generally don't meet and then feel like the spell doesn't work. The reality is they're just not strong enough for the spell to function properly, so some enemies are still going through and the encounters are still happening. But people will just blame it on the spell, not the fact that they have the caveat. Another complaint is the frequency of random encounters. People feel like random encounters happening way too often to a point of annoyance, although clearly this is hyperbole, like how people say RPGs don't have level grinding. Clearly it's people just exaggerating or going on hearsay, but in reality, I've rarely seen an RPG really have that bad of an encounter rate, especially with the mythical I took one step random encounter. I only ever had that once. I had that happen once in my whole life where that actually happened, but it's one of the complaints that they're too frequent. Which I say, what's the difference between random encounters that are too frequent and rooms that are filtered with enemies that are unavoidable? Like that's a Pokemon. Pokemon has random encounters, but it also has trainers who you generally can't avoid. Some of them, you can avoid their gaze, others, no, you have to do battle, it's unavoidable. And that's a case where the reason people bring that up because of Pokemon, the fact that the trainer battles are effectively enemies you see on the overworld, but you can't avoid them. Or something like, let's say, the Souls franchise, which love having a lot of enemies in an area, so the people complain about the fact of there's too many enemies in a Souls game are jumping your ass. I mean, random encounter or not, it's still a bunch of people jumping your ass. One thing I'll mention that I haven't really seen people really mention at all themselves is one of the big pluses to see enemies on the overworld is being able to go for specific enemies, whether it be a side quest that requires it, or let's say something like the Atelier franchise, where enemies drop certain material. So you would want to know where each enemy is, so you don't waste your time getting a random enemy that's not necessary for the thing you're trying to do. Like I said, these people bring this aspect up because the biggest reason people generally don't like encounters, period, is because, well, they just don't want to play the game, they just want to go to the next story segment, so they don't want anything to interrupt that. Another thing is how games try to handle having enemies be viewable. Where maybe something like, let's say, Final Fantasy 15, where you'll just have enemies on the field and can immediately initiate a fight, Generally, maybe got to jump on them with the Warp Strike, but it's the fact that enemies are freeable and can go after you. Although, my question is, does that mean when the Imperials just drop a robot army, does that take account of random encounter because you don't know when it's coming aside from one of the characters alerting you a few seconds beforehand? Or does not account for a random encounter? Actual genuine question. Does that count? Another example is generally something like Persona 3, 4, and 5, where you'll just have something that represents the enemy, but you don't really see what it is, which is one of those weird aspects when games do that, where you can see the enemy on the map, but at the same time, you still don't know what it is. But it gives players the control of the initiative. But it's also really finicky, like in that Persona 3, at least before reload, you have to hit the enemy from behind in order to get the initiative, which, good luck doing that. Persona 4 had a weird instance where the flying enemies were just annoying to hit, and Gola just decided, big blob. That's somewhat also annoying to hit because the player character's freaking attack arc is so weird. Then Persona 5, where you can stealth around, which in theory should be the easiest case, but there are times where there's nothing to pretty much hide behind. You have to manually walk up and get the ambush. And sometimes it's finicky, where sometimes they instead just do the smack, which is the more neutral position, it's supposed to be an advantageous one. And there'll be times where, for some reason, the game will just decide, nah, they hit you first, F you. Which is one of those weird aspects. Which, granted, random encounters and roll the dice when that you get initiative, but at least you have stats that generally benefit that, like generally RPGs have luck stat that increases your chance for initiative, so the roll of dice can be more in your favor, as opposed to a game just being finicky. I see people mention Metaphor Fantazio, but that's also a case where, once again, you have to smack the enemy several times to get the advantage, so you're being a big risk versus reward. Granted, the reward is a lot greater compared to other examples, but still, one smack means you're still on the back foot, which is generally not the best. A game that's often praised for quote-unquote getting random encounters right is the Bravely Default franchise, because you can increase or decrease random encounter rates. Although I believe the remaster changed it to where you can no longer turn off encounters by default to unlock it. By the way, you can shift the encounter rate. But the problem with that is, how does one balance a game where you can just flat out not get EXP and just not play the game? Like, it's one of those aspects where people will praise the mechanic, but it's also one of weird thing where you can just turn off encounters, or kick encounters to overdrive and just make yourself more powerful than probably developers even thought you would. Granted, because it's really default, I feel like that slider is more there for the job system of the game, so you can grind them out better. But it's also a weird case where it's just like, people praise the idea of turning off encounters, which is not just really default. Anytime an RPG gets re-released and one of the features is turn off battles, for some reason people praise that. Like, it's a weird thing in RPGs where people praise the idea of flat out not playing the game. I can't think of any other genre in which people praise the idea of not playing the game. Like, even fighting games, simple inputs, generally they still have some sort of input system that can be different from regular inputs, but they're still there. Turning off encounters in general, even in games where you see enemies, is just weird. It's just the idea of just not playing the game. No other genre has that. Does anyone think about that? I think about that. Another thing people bring up, you can backtrack into an earlier area where the enemies are no longer up to your level, and people just waste the encounters in that case, because the enemies don't really stand a chance. I should also bring up the ability of just being able to immediately defeat enemies that are that weak, to which I say, how about instead of just having enemies that are that weak to begin with, how about instead lower areas get updated? Not like, let's say, I don't want the enemies like, let's say, level up with you, no. I'm like showing Residence Refrain, where because you're going back to the same opening areas when you go out to the world to explore, the enemies, as the game progresses, change and get more powerful, so that way it's never just boring to fight enemies, because they'll join a public challenge. So something like that instead, where enemies can get updated. Granted, there are some games where knowing where an enemy is very important, but it's one of those things where if you want a more challenge, well, let the game instead just update enemies a bit, or at least add more powerful variants in those locales once you're further in the story, so that way backtracking isn't boring. Another quirk when it comes to viewable enemies on the battlefield that people don't really bring up often is when RPGs will just place very powerful enemies out in the open just because. So let's say Final Fantasy 13 or Xenoblade Chronicle franchises will generally just have very powerful enemies. Xenoblade is pretty much infamous for having level 80 gorilla that one-shots your party kind of thing, which people try to defend as, oh, it's a living ecosystem, we're powerful. No, it was a living ecosystem, that monkey would be attacking other enemies. It doesn't. It goes for the player only, because that living ecosystem, it's just being a jerk. Back to Persona, even Personas 3, 4, and 5 will generally just have stuff like the Reaper that is there to also punish players who stay too long on the area. It's Persona 4, where it's like buying a chest requires opening a lot of chests and stuff, but it's more complicated and honestly lamer. But Persona 3 and 5 generally have the Reaper show up and you stay too long on the floor, although P5 is only in mementos. But it's one of those things where, kind of one of those weird aspects where, despite the fact you can see enemies coming and everything, there's still a measure they put in place to punish players who stay too long, potentially grinding an area, or sometimes Persona 3 has special floors where it just increases the chances of the Reaper showing up. Well, they'll pretty much be an enemy that's just designed to just F you over, and you better run for it. Which is also another quirk when it comes to, I mentioned before, with you'll see enemies on the screen, when developers just put more powerful enemies that you can possibly handle at the time. In the case of the Reaper, that's there to punish the player in a very weird way, but okay, Atlus. Another major complaint random encounters is when dungeons have puzzles where people feel like the random encounter interrupts the puzzle or makes them forget their train of thought because an encounter just popped up. So try to say, once again, is this complaint happening when you can see enemies? Especially some games have enemies generally all over the place in a dungeon. Like, I'm just saying, when it comes to like being able to see enemies, people will of course take out all the enemies first, then do the puzzle, which kind of just completely puts the control of everything in the player's hands entirely because, well, you can just decide if anything's going to be a nuisance or not. Which is one of the weird aspects when it comes to also being able to see enemies, the fact that the player just runs up and smacks them and starts to fight and everything. So the player could just decide, you know what, I want all the enemies gone to make this simpler, and then just, what's left? You're just left with a puzzle and nothing else. Kind of like, for example, Persona Q, which heavily borrows from Entered Odyssey, but those games will generally have the FO, despite random encounters, will have the FOEs, be it's one enemy that you can see that you have to avoid, with the puzzles being built around trying to do something while avoiding them. But if you just take out the FOE, what's there to stop you? The answer is nothing, especially if FOE the most powerful thing in the room. So random encounters will stand a chance you can kill one of those things. Which is also a weird aspect where the puzzle is less doing an activity, the puzzle is just not getting into a fight with an enemy you can see. Weirdly enough. And random encounters are just there for the actual battles you want to do, but you decide, you know what, the FOE, it's going down, then there's kind of nothing left for the game to do to stop you. Another feature that I've seen people enjoy with random encounter-based RPGs is an indicator that lets you know when a battle's about to happen, which, for me, never really did anything. I already see what's the point of just knowing enemies coming. It's the random encounter system. But for some people, they prefer knowing when it's exactly about to happen, so they have the Legend of Dragoon's indicator changing, or SMT3 Nocturne's indicator changing. Generally, it's something that people enjoy because they have an idea of when to expect a fight, which I guess it's a psychological thing, because like I said, it doesn't do anything for me, but if people enjoy it, then that's good for them. Overall, I think random encounters are fine, especially since a bunch of RPGs will have stuff to reduce encounter rates. Like I said, I prefer Megaten's Estoma ability, which reduces encounter rates below your level specifically, but I know some people will just prefer no encounters, period, whatsoever. At that point, why are you even playing the game? But it's one of those things where people will prefer that, but each side has their own pros and cons, since being able to see enemies means you're running forward, you're leading the charge, and you can just annihilate everything you feel like it, or just run past everything, because generally in those games, you're the fastest thing in the room. So they're not really a threat against you. So it's one of the weird aspects where a random encounter adds friction, it takes control away from the player for a battle to break out, having you on the back foot. But like I said, there are some instances where you do specifically want to know what you're up against. So some RPGs like Atelier, showing the enemy beforehand, lets you know, okay, I need to find that thing over here, and okay, that's the thing, that's the material I need for this. Alright, let's go. Or some older RPG, like maybe Final Fantasy IV, has very rare weapons that have a low chance to pretty much come out of a battle. So they not only get the random encounter, then hope it's the random encounter the enemy you want, just to have a chance at the item. And I know it's kind of a rare thing nowadays. RPGs don't really do having like hidden weapons like that, but it's one of those things that, as taken into account, to be fair, that some random encounter games do, where they'll just have rare items behind low freaking spawn rates from enemies. But it's just one of those things where people just try so hard to want to get random encounters because they feel like it's just inconvenient, when, not gonna lie, the inconvenience is kind of part of the points. I mean, it's there so when you go to a dungeon, you're using resources. You're not just going in there perfectly when you feel comfortable to fight the boss. You're going in there to not only gain experience, but to also be prepared for the boss and work with what you got. You're able to walk around with everything perfectly done, then it kind of just removes any and all tension whatsoever. But like I said, there are some games where you can see enemies, they'll just have the enemies jump you anyway, which you can then argue, what's the point of it being able to see enemies if they jump you? Or what's the point of being able to see enemies if you can't see what they look like and only get a representation of enemy, but not the exact thing? You know, you can go back and forth all day, every day with this topic. I don't know, once our brothers it felt like random encounters were necessary because people just won't put a game otherwise, but he later rephrased it to saying that random encounters aren't necessarily the thing that has to happen. It's just the player has to engage with the game. Like I said, people feeling being able to turn off encounters is a quote-unquote quality of life improvement. Once again, there's no other genre I can think of in which people will decide that not playing the game is somehow an improvement, you know? So I just wanted to ramble about that is all. Go out there, play games, random encounters, or not. Whichever your choice. There are many kind of RPGs out there. Anyway, go out there, play games.